In the summer of 1887, on the sun-scorched prairies of Wyoming, 7 outlaws made 3 mistakes. The first mistake was stopping a carriage in broad daylight and kidnapping a young woman. The second mistake was stealing the leather bag she was protecting with her life. And the third mistake, the mistake that would kill every single one of them, was deciding not to shoot the old cowboy, sitting quietly on the driver's seat. When they saw him, in their eyes he was just a tired man. His shirt was faded, his face weathered by the sun and wind, and his eyes were as cold as ashes after many years of wandering. An old driver, not worth wasting a bullet on. But before the sun rose again, the whole gang would realize something far too late. That man was no ordinary driver. His name was Elias Crow. And many years ago, in dusty towns, in dimly lit saloons, amidst the sound of galloping hooves and echoing gunshots through the canyons, people used to whisper another name for him, the ghost of Black Ridge. That afternoon, the sky over Red Hollow was blindingly blue. The sun hung high, pouring heat down on the earth like pouring fire. The dry grass bowed to the wind, and road dust clung to the wheels, the horses' hooves, and even the collars of the 2 people quietly crossing that vast land. The old carriage rolled slowly down the dirt road, and the 2 draft horses were getting tired. The wheels creaked every time they crushed over a rough patch of rocks. On the driver's seat, Elias Crow held the reins with his calloused hands. He was in his 40s, but his face made people think he was much older than that. Not because of his age, but because of the things he had seen. A wide-brimmed hat covered almost half of his face, his shirt was bleached by the sun, and his boots had worn-out heels. He wore an old leather belt, and a revolver hung at his side, looking as ordinary as its owner. That was exactly the appearance Elias wanted people to see. An old cowboy, a hired driver, a man who had lived too long in the sun and wind, with nothing left to make others wary. Sitting next to him was Clara Whitmore. She was 23 years old, younger than this land, but her eyes were not naive in the slightest. Clara wore a simple traveling dress, wrapped in a light brown coat, with her hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck. In her hands she tightly clutched an old leather bag. Since that morning she had checked that bag an uncountable number of times. Elias knew as he saw everything. He saw the way Clara looked toward the horizon, and the way her hand tightened around the bag every time the carriage passed a desolate stretch of road. He noticed how she would stay silent for too long, then suddenly drop a random question, just to cover up the anxiety rising in her heart. He asked nothing, because long ago, Elias had learned that some secrets should only be opened when the one keeping them feels ready. But even though Clara hadn't said a word, he still understood one thing. Inside that bag was something more valuable than money, so valuable that this girl was ready to die to keep it. After hours of silence, Clara spoke softly. "Mr. Crow, how much further is it to Red Hollow?" Elias looked straight ahead. "If the road is peaceful, we will arrive before dark. And if it is not peaceful," he did not turn to her, "then we will know before we get there." Clara looked at him for a long time. That answer did not reassure her, but it did not make her more afraid either. There was something very strange in his voice, as he didn't speak like someone who was guessing. He spoke like as a man who was used to trouble, so used to it that he could hear it from afar, before it even took shape. A gust of wind swept across the prairie. Elias tilted his head slightly, looking toward a low ridge of rocks on the horizon. Dust. A thin trail of dust was rising behind the slope. It wasn't caused by the wind, nor was it caused by cattle. It was horses. He pulled the reins gently, and the carriage slowed down. "What is the matter?" Clara sensed the change. Elias did not answer yet, glancing to his left just as a figure on horseback glided behind a bush. Then another appeared, and from the front, 6 riders rushed out from behind the rocky ridge, lining up horizontally to block the road completely. Clara clutched the leather bag tightly to her chest. Elias stopped the carriage. 7 armed men surrounded them. The leader wore a black coat. He had broad shoulders, stubble, and a face as hard as a boulder. He rode a gray horse, with 2 revolvers hanging low at his hips. His gaze swept past Elias for only a moment before stopping on Clara. He smiled, a smile without a single trace of kindness. "Good afternoon," he said. "The road is quite dusty today, isn't it?" Elias remained silent. The man smirked. "The old man doesn't like to talk, huh?" Still, not a sound in response. Another outlaw sneered. "He's probably scared stiff." Clara tried to keep her voice calm. "What do you want?" The leader tilted his head to look at her. "Are you Clara Whitmore?" She did not answer, but that silence itself was the answer. He nodded slowly. "I am Maddox Vane, and I think you are holding on to something that doesn't belong to you." "Get out of our way!" Clara hugged the bag tighter. Maddox laughed. "You've got guts, just like your father." That statement made Clara's expression change, only for a very brief moment. But Elias saw it. He also saw how the 7 outlaws positioned themselves. 2 blocking the front, 1 holding the horses. 1 circled behind the carriage, and the remaining 2 stood diagonally on both sides, locking down every escape route. These were not amateur bandits. They had done this many times. 1 outlaw jumped off his horse and snatched the leather bag from Clara's hands. She resisted, but he was too strong. The bag was tossed over to Maddox. Maddox opened it and rummaged through it, finding only a few papers, a small notebook and an envelope, with a broken wax seal inside. He frowned. "Is this all?" "That is everything." Clara looked him straight in the eye. Maddox stepped closer. "You are a terrible liar, Miss Whitmore." He gave a signal, and 2 outlaws dragged Clara down from the carriage. She struggled, but one pinned her arms tightly, while the other pointed a gun at Elias. "Sit still right there, old man." Elias sat still. Clara turned to look at him, terror in her eyes, and then terror slowly turned into disappointment. She had thought this man would at least do something, say a word or stand up, try to stop them, but Elias Crow just sat still, his 2 hands resting on the reins, his eyes sinking into the shadows beneath the brim of his hat. Maddox was also looking at him. "Smart move, old man. You live a long time by knowing when to keep your mouth shut." Elias slowly looked up. His gaze slid past Maddox, past the gun barrels, past the horses, and stopped on a saddle. Stamped on the saddle leather was a small mark, a letter B intertwined within a ring of thorny brambles, the brand of the Blackthorn Ranch. He recognized it immediately, and right at that moment he understood. This was not a robbery, nor was it a kidnapping for ransom. There was a wealthy man behind it all, someone powerful enough to hire 7 gunmen to strike in broad daylight. And that person wanted Clara Whitmore to disappear. Before she could set foot in Red Hollow, Maddox turned his horse around. "Take her." Clara was pushed onto the back of a horse, the reins held by an outlaw. Before the whole group left, Maddox glanced back at Elias. "What about this old guy?" "Just shoot him to make it quick," one outlaw suggested. Maddox looked at him a moment longer, then laughed. "No need. He isn't worth a bullet. Just drag him along. Who knows, the boss might want to ask him a few questions." And so they took Clara away, and they also took Elias away. They confiscated his revolver, searched his shirt pockets, pants pockets, and even checked his boots. But not a single one thought to tie his hands tightly, because in their eyes, Elias Crow was just a frightened old man. The convoy headed west, crossing dry prairies and dried-up streams. The sun tilted lower, casting long shadows of the horses across the ground. Clara was sandwiched between 2 outlaws. She remained silent, but her eyes never stopped observing. Elias rode in the back, his hands resting loosely on the saddle, looking tired and helpless. But in his mind, everything was being rearranged, bit by bit. 7 men, Maddox's vein was right-handed, but every time he drew his gun, his left shoulder hunched slightly forward. A bad habit. The youngest carried a rifle, but the strap was too long. If caught by surprise, it would definitely get tangled. The skinny one hid a knife in his right boot, while the red-bearded one drank liquor the whole way, his eyes already starting to get cloudy. The one guarding the rear was a decent shot, but afraid of the dark. Then there was one more, the one with the Blackthorn Ranch brand on his saddle. He rode very steadily, spoke little, and kept his eyes glued to Elias more than any of the others. That guy was the dangerous one. Elias memorized it all. People still thought a surviving gunman stayed alive by being a fast draw, but the truth was different. The gunmen who lived the longest were not the fastest. They were the ones who knew how to wait. Near dusk, the outlaws arrived at an abandoned wooden cabin by a small stream. This place used to be a resting post for cattle ranchers, but it had been abandoned for many years. The wooden roof sagged, the walls were cracked, and the window was missing a shutter. Next to it was an old stable and a cracked, dry water trough, a perfect place to hide people. Clara was dragged inside the house, while Elias was kept in the yard, next to the fence. One outlaw found an old Winchester rifle hidden under the cargo crates on the carriage. He held it up and laughed loudly. "Look at this thing! This gun must be older than the old man." The other guys burst out laughing. Elias did not laugh. None of them noticed that the gun had been meticulously oiled. None of them noticed that the barrel was absolutely devoid of a single speck of rust. And none of them wondered why a truly tired old man would keep a Winchester rifle so clean. Inside the house, Maddox threw the leather bag onto the table. "What are you hiding, Clara?" "I already told you. They are just my father's papers." "Your father is dead." Clara's voice turned cold. "He was murdered." Maddox looked at her for a moment. "Who said that?" "Anyone who still has a conscience," he chuckled dryly. "A conscience doesn't live long in Red Hollow." Clara did not reply. Maddox stepped closer. "Your father once thought he could go up against Augustus Blackthorn. He thought a few papers, a few signatures, and a few cowardly witnesses would be enough to take down the richest man in this region. Do you know what happened?" Clara looked at him, her eyes red with anger. "I know. He burned to death in the stable, and you people called it an accident." Maddox leaned in close. "Then you should learn from his death." Clara did not back down a single step. "No, I learned that if good people stay silent, evil people will rewrite the truth themselves." Out in the yard, Elias heard every word of that. He gently bowed his head as an old memory resurfaced. Another man, an old friend, Clara's father, Thomas Whitmore. Many years ago it was Thomas who had saved Elias from the gallows for a crime he didn't commit. Thomas was one of the very few lawyers in the West who still believed that the truth was worth more than money. A few weeks ago, Elias received a letter from him, a letter pleading for help. Thomas wrote that he had found evidence against Blackthorn, and he needed Elias to escort his daughter safely to Red Hollow. But when Elias arrived, Thomas was already dead. The stable burned to ashes. And Clara was left with only a leather bag, along with her father's final instructions. That time, Elias had arrived late. This time, he didn't plan to be late a second time. Night fell, and the outlaws built a fire, drinking liquor, chewing on dried meat, telling dirty stories, and laughing loudly, as if everything was already settled. Maddox was still inside the house, continuing to interrogate Clara. A short while later, a stranger on horseback galloped in from the direction of Red Hollow and shoved a piece of paper into Maddox's hand. The exchange was very short, but Elias heard enough. "Mr. Blackthorn wants the girl brought to the ranch before dawn." "And the old man?" Maddox asked. "Doesn't matter, but don't let the girl reach the courthouse. If necessary, make it look like an accident." Elias closed his eyes. So it was clear. Clara hadn't been taken just to scare her. She was taken so she would never return. Around midnight, a cold wind swept across the prairie. The fire burned lower, and the liquor in the bottles dwindled. The laughter grew sparse. Inside the house, Maddox grabbed Clara's coat. He was about to toss it aside, but suddenly noticed that the stitching in the lining was thicker than usual. He drew his knife and sliced it open lightly. Several pieces of paper fell out. Maddox picked them up to read, and his expression changed entirely. They were forged land transfer documents, a list of families coerced into selling their land by Blackthorn, along with the names of witnesses who had disappeared, and even a copy of a letter showing that Sheriff Harlan Creed had taken money to turn a blind eye to it all. Maddox swallowed hard. He had thought he was only hired to kidnap a girl, but now, in his hands was enough to hang a whole tycoon. He shoved the papers back into the coat and stepped outside. "Keep a close watch," he yelled. "Before dawn, we leave this place." Elias heard every word clearly. The window of time was closing. He needed to strike, not at dawn, but tonight. A wolf howled somewhere far away. 2 guards stood in the yard. One leaned against the fence, gun in hand, but with his eyes already drooping. The other kept chugging liquor, occasionally peeking in to look at the house. Elias sat leaning his back against a wooden post, his head bowed low as if dozing off. But he was counting every footstep, counting every breath, counting the distance from his spot to the old Winchester rifle, counting the time every time the guard turned his head. Then the opportunity came. The first guard muttered something, put down his gun, and walked toward the bushes. The remaining one was left alone, and he raised the liquor bottle to his mouth. When the bottle obscured his vision, Elias stood up. Not fast, not rushed, without a sound, just like a shadow detaching itself from the fence. The guard lowered the bottle. That was the last thing he managed to do. Elias's hand locked onto his wrist, yanked hard, followed by a crisp strike under the jaw. The guard collapsed, and Elias caught his body before it even hit the ground. No noise, no gunshot. He took back the keys, took back the small knife in the guard's pocket, and walked toward the house. Clara was sitting huddled in the corner, her hands tied, and when the door opened, she looked up sharply. Elias stepped inside. Clara froze. "You came back." He cut the ropes for her. "I never left." For a moment, Clara did not know what to say. Elias handed her the coat. "Take this, let's go." She hugged the coat to her chest. "What about the child?" Elias paused. Clara lowered her voice. "There is a little boy in the back room, the son of a farming family. They kidnapped him to force his parents to sign away their land." Elias's eyes darkened, and he opened the back door. In the small room, a boy of about 8 years old was sitting curled up, his mouth gagged, his eyes full of fear. Elias knelt down and removed the cloth gag. "What is your name?" "Samuel," the boy trembled. "Samuel, listen carefully to what I say. We are going to go outside very quietly. You walk behind Miss Clara. Do not cry, and do not run ahead. Understood?" The boy nodded. All 3 quietly left the house. Everything should have gone smoothly, if the guard who had just gone into the bushes hadn't returned at that exact moment. He saw them, taking exactly 1 second to understand what was happening, and then he screamed, "They are running!" The whole camp erupted. Maddox kicked the door open. "Catch them!" Gunshots rang out. Clara hugged Samuel and dashed toward the stable, while Elias ran beside them. His body hunched low. Bullets bit into the dirt right behind them, kicking up dust like rain. One outlaw raised a rifle, and Elias snatched the old Winchester, propped against the cargo wagon. One shot. The oil lamp hanging in front of the porch shattered, and darkness swallowed half the camp. The second shot. The gun in the outlaw's hands flew right out of his grip. No one even had time to see how Elias had aimed. A strange moment of silence fell over the entire yard. Then a trembling voice spoke up. It cannot be. It was Rory Flint, the quietest outlaw in the group. He stood next to the fire, his face pale, his eyes locked onto Elias. "Shoot, you idiots!" Maddox yelled. But Rory did not raise his gun. He took a step back. "That is him." Maddox snapped his head around. "Who?" Rory swallowed hard. "The ghost of Black Ridge." That name dropped into the middle of the yard, as cold as a bullet. A few outlaws froze. Maddox looked at Elias, then let out a forced laugh. "It's just a saloon tale." Elias cocked his rifle. A metallic clack echoed in the night very softly, but enough to wipe the smile right off Maddox's face. "You should have let me go my way," Elias said. Maddox gritted his teeth. "Kill him!" Guns fired again, but the darkness, the panicked horses, the smoke from the oil lamp, and the screaming made the outlaws shoot wildly. Elias did not try to kill them all. He only shot at the hands holding the guns, at the reins, at the wheels, at anything that could slow them down. Clara hoisted Samuel onto the back of a small horse and then jumped on behind him, while Elias vaulted onto the horse next to them. Maddox pointed his gun at Clara. "Stop!" Elias twisted around in his saddle, his voice low, but it rang out clearly amidst the chaos. "You can pull the trigger, but before the gunshot fades, you will understand why people call me the Ghost." Maddox's hand trembled, and in that moment, Rory Flint threw his gun to the ground, turned his horse, and dashed into the darkness. Fear spread faster than fire. Clara urged her horse forward, and Elias followed. The three of them galloped out into the night prairie, leaving behind the cursing, the chaotic sound of hooves, and Maddox howling in a fit of rage. They rode for many hours straight. The freezing night wind whipped against their faces. Clara held Samuel with one arm, using the other to tightly grip the coat. The boy was shivering from fear, but he did not cry. Elias rode at the rear, occasionally glancing back into the darkness behind them. There were pursuers, 3 people, then 2, then 1. As morning approached, the final sound of hooves faded away completely. They stopped by a dry creek, and Clara slid off the saddle, almost collapsing. Samuel sat huddled against her, his face pale. Elias dismounted, scanning the horizon in a full circle before turning back. "We rest for a moment." Clara looked at him, and this time she looked very closely. It was no longer the gaze meant for an old carriage driver, nor was it a look of disappointment. It was the look of someone who had just realized she had been sitting next to a secret for a whole day. "Who are you?" she asked. Elias lifted his canteen and took a sip. "I am the man taking you to Red Hollow." "No." Clara shook her head. "I am asking who you really are." He remained silent. The dawn slowly dyed the horizon gold. Beneath the layers of dust and wrinkles, his face suddenly looked more exhausted than ever. "There was a time people called me by a name," he said. "The Ghost of Black Ridge." He did not answer, but Clara already had her answer. Samuel looked up and asked softly, "Are you a bad person, sir?" Elias looked at the boy. "There are people who would say so." "And what about you?" Elias stayed silent for a very long time. "I used to do many things I am not proud of. But tonight you saved us," Clara said softly. Elias looked in the direction of Red Hollow. "One good deed doesn't erase the past. But it can start something else," Clara replied. Elias said nothing more. Those words touched a place very deep inside him, a place he had tried to bury away for a long time. By mid-morning they hit the road again. When the first roofs of Red Hollow appeared, Clara breathed a sigh of relief. It was a small town situated in the middle of a dry valley, with train tracks running across. A wooden church, a few general stores, a saloon, and the sheriff's office, right at the head of the main street. "We are here," Clara said. "The sheriff will protect Samuel, and I will hand the papers over to the courthouse." Elias did not answer. He was looking toward the sheriff's office. A horse was tied to the front porch, its saddle stamped with a letter B intertwined within a ring of thorny brambles. The brand of blackthorn. Elias pulled the reins to a stop. Clara turned to him. "What is wrong? We are not safe yet," he said quietly. The office door opened and Sheriff Harlan Creed stepped out. He had a potbelly, a thick mustache, and a neat coat. Beside him was a man dressed in expensive riding clothes, his collar unbelievably white for a town so engulfed in dust. Clara recognized him, Blackthorn's man. The two men exchanged a few words and then burst out laughing together. The blood seemed to drain from Clara's face. Elias glanced at the notice board next to the office, where a wanted poster had just been pinned up. He urged his horse closer. On the paper was a sketched face of himself, with words printed below. Wanted, Elias Crow, crimes, kidnapping Clara Whitmore, murdering Thomas Whitmore, stealing land documents. Clara finished reading, her lips trembling. No. A few townsfolk had already begun to notice them. Some whispered, and some pointed. Some quietly retreated into their houses. In just one night, the man who wanted to save Clara had been turned into her kidnapper. Meanwhile, the person truly behind it all still sat safely on his vast ranch, waiting for the whole town to obediently believe his lies. Elias turned his horse around. "We have to go." "Go where?" "To someone who still knows how to distinguish law from justice." The old warehouse near the railroad tracks was almost completely abandoned. The smells of dry hay, machine oil, and rotting wood mingled together, and Clara led Samuel inside first. Elias stood outside observing for a moment before stepping in. From the darkness behind a pile of wooden crates, a deep voice echoed out. "I heard you were dead, Elias." Elias stopped in his tracks. An older man stepped out. His hair was gray, but his posture was still straight. Pinned to his shirt was the star of a U.S. Marshal, Nathaniel Pike. He looked at Elias, then looked over at Clara and Samuel. "It seems your death caused just as much trouble as when you were alive." Elias exhaled. "I need your help." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "The last time you said that, 3 people got shot. A warehouse burned down, and I lost my best horse. This time might be even worse." Nathaniel looked at Clara. "So, tell me the story." Over the next hour, Clara recounted everything. The death of her father, the land papers, Maddox Vane, Blackthorn, Sheriff Creed. Nathaniel listened without interrupting a single time, and when Clara pulled out the stack of papers hidden in her coat, his face grew serious. "This is enough to open a federal investigation," he said, "but it is not enough to make the townsfolk dare to stand up. They have feared Blackthorn for too long." "So what do we do?" Clara tightened her grip. "Bring the truth out into the middle of the street," Elias said. Nathaniel looked at him. "You know Blackthorn will not let her speak." "I know, and you also know, as soon as you step out there, the whole town will recognize who you are." Elias lowered his eyes. "I have run long enough." Nathaniel looked at his old friend, a flicker of sadness in his eyes. Clara realized there was another story between these two men. Nathaniel turned to her. "Your father was a good man, Clara. He saved many people, and among them was Elias." Clara looked at Elias. "My father knew you?" Elias was silent. Nathaniel continued. 15 years ago, Elias was framed for murder in Black Ridge. The one behind it was Augustus Blackthorn, and Thomas Whitmore was the only lawyer brave enough to step forward and prove Elias's innocence. Clara was stunned. Elias spoke softly. "Your father saved my life." "Then why didn't you come to save him?" The question dropped down, heavy and burdened. Elias looked at her. "I received the letter too late." Clara saw a pain in his eyes that could not be faked. "And you think it is your fault?" "I know it is my fault." She shook her head. "No, the one at fault is the person who murdered him." Elias did not reply, but deep inside him an old wound had just been touched. That afternoon, the news that Clara was still alive spread throughout Red Hollow, and Augustus Blackthorne finally appeared. He rode into town along with more than 10 gunmen, around 50 years old, wearing an elegant black coat, leather gloves, and a neatly trimmed mustache. A man with an elegant appearance, but with eyes as cold as chilled steel. Sheriff Creed came all the way out to the street to welcome him, while the townsfolk gathered on both sides of the street, no one daring to speak loudly. Blackthorne stopped his horse in front of the sheriff's office, casting his eyes around as if this entire town was his private property. Then he saw Clara stepping out from the direction of the warehouse, and beside her was Marshal Nathaniel Pike, and behind them, Elias Crow. The crowd immediately erupted in a commotion, and an old saloon owner stepped back. A blacksmith's eyes widened, and an old woman covered her mouth with her hand. The name, Ghost of Black Ridge, might have faded from the memories of the young. But for those who had lived through that time, it had never truly died. Blackthorne looked at Elias, and his smile hardened. "Crow," he said, "I thought your bones had already rotted away in some corner." "I was also hoping you had learned how to tell the truth," Elias retorted. Blackthorne smiled coldly, then turned to the crowd. "People of Red Hollow, you are looking at a murderer, a criminal who kidnapped Miss Whitmore and invented all sorts of lies to save his own life." Clara stepped forward. "No, the one lying is you." The crowd was dead silent. She held the stack of papers high. "My father collected evidence. Augustus Blackthorne forged land documents. He forced poor families to sell their ranches. Anyone who resisted was threatened. Anyone who dared to speak out disappeared. And Sheriff Creed took money to cover it all up. Arrest her!" Sheriff Creed barked, but Nathaniel Pike stepped up, his hand resting on the star on his chest. "Just try it." The air grew as tense as a snapping string, and Blackthorne's gunmen rested their hands near their holsters. Elias stood still, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. But it was that exact calmness that made no one dare to draw their gun first. Blackthorne looked around. "Are you going to believe a panicking girl and a murderer? Or believe me, the man who brought jobs, money, and safety to this land?" No one answered. That silence broke Clara's heart, and she looked at the faces around her. Many people here knew the truth. Many had lost their land, lost their families, lost their loved ones, but they were afraid. Then from the back of the crowd, a trembling, aged voice rang out. "I believe her." An old man leaning on a cane stepped forward. It was Mr. Miller, the man who had lost his ranch to Blackthorne 2 years ago. "My papers were swapped out too," he said, his voice trembling. "I did not dare to say a word, because I still had my young grandchildren." A widowed woman stepped forward. "My husband died after refusing to sell his land." The blacksmith spoke up. "I once repaired a wagon for Blackthorne's men, right on the night Mr. Whitmore's house went up in flames. One person, then 2 people, then many more. The truth started to spread like a fire, catching onto dry grass." Blackthorne looked at the crowd, and for the first time his eyes revealed true, seething anger. "Have you all forgotten who feeds this town?" From the end of the street, the sound of galloping hooves rang out. Maddox Vane appeared. He was injured in the shoulder, his face covered in dust, his coat torn to shreds, but he was still alive. Behind him was Rory Flint, his hands tied, his head hung low like a man who had lost his soul. Blackthorne scowled. "Maddox, what are you doing here?" Maddox looked at him. "Doing the very thing I should have done, right from the start. Watch your words." Maddox laughed bitterly. I have been careful my whole life, and the result is I only ended up being a hunting dog for you. You were planning to dump all the blame on me, weren't you? If things fell apart, Maddox Vane kidnapped the girl. Maddox Vane killed people. Maddox Vane acted on his own. And Augustus Blackthorne comes out as clean as holy water. The crowd buzzed with commotion. Maddox pointed his finger at Sheriff Creed. He was the one who paid us. Money from Blackthorne. Take the girl. Take the papers. Bring her back to the ranch before dawn. And if necessary, kill her. Liar! Sheriff Creed turned pale. He is telling the truth, Rory Flint said with a trembling voice. Blackthorne slowly took off his gloves, and all the elegance on his face vanished. What remained was the real man. Someone used to giving orders who had never thought a day would come when he would be defied. Enough, he said. Then he drew his gun, not aiming at Elias, but aiming at Clara. Elias moved, so fast that many people only had time to see the hem of his coat flutter. A gunshot, then a second. Blackthorne's gun fell to the ground as blood poured out from his hand. He dropped to his knees, howling in pain. Elias stood right there, a thin wisp of smoke still lingering at the muzzle of his gun. Not a single one of Blackthorne's gunmen dared to twitch. Nathaniel Pike stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. Augustus Blackthorne, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, forging land documents, and bribing a public official. Sheriff Creed tried to back away into the office, but the blacksmith and two farmers stood blocking the path. For the first time in so many years, Red Hollow was no longer bowing its head. Not because they were entirely out of fear, but because one person had dared to stand up, then a second, then a third. And when enough people stand up together, fear begins to lose its power. A few months later, Red Hollow had changed. Not everything was perfect right away. The West had never been as gentle as the songs told it. The land was still arid. The winters were still cold, and cattle could still die from disease. People still had to work to the point of exhaustion just to keep their roofs over their heads. But some things were different. The families who had lost their land began to have their deeds reviewed, and the Blackthorne Ranch was confiscated. Sheriff Creed was escorted away in iron shackles, while Maddox Vane testified in court in exchange for a lighter sentence. No one called him a good person, but at least for the first time in his life, he had told the truth. Exactly at a time when the truth could have cost him his life. Young Samuel returned to his family, and Clara Whitmore kept her father's ranch. She turned the place into a rest stop for those passing through Red Hollow. A place with clean water, a stable, a hot meal, and a small room for anyone with nowhere else to go. People said she was just like her father. Clara wasn't sure if that was true, but she hoped it was. One late autumn afternoon, Elias Crow stood on the porch, looking at the long road leading out of town. His horse was saddled and his luggage bag was tied neatly at the back. Clara stepped out. "You are leaving?" Elias did not turn around. "I have stayed long enough." "Long enough for whom?" He remained silent. Clara came and stood next to him. "You still think a man like you shouldn't stay?" Elias looked down at his hands. "There are things that cannot be washed clean, Clara." She replied gently. "Road dust can be washed away. Blood can also be washed away. Only a person who constantly condemns himself is the one no one can save." Elias looked at her. "My father once believed in you," Clara continued. "Marshall Pike believes in you. Samuel believes in you. And this whole town, even though they fear you, still knows that you saved them. And what about you?" Clara looked straight into his eyes. "I believe in the man who came back in the night, right when I thought I had been abandoned. I believe in the man who saved a child, even though it made the whole plan more dangerous. I believe in the man who could have disappeared, but chose to stand in the middle of the street to tell the truth." Elias turned his face away. The wind blew across the prairie, and far away, a train blew its whistle as it passed Red Hollow. "You have run away from the past long enough, Elias," Clara said softly. "Maybe this time you should try staying." Elias did not answer right away, looking at the road instead. That road used to be his escape. Whenever a town began to remember who he was, he would get on his horse and leave. Whenever someone mentioned Black Ridge, he would disappear before dawn. He had spent all these long years living like a ghost, believing it was the only way to stop hurting anyone else. But now, behind him was a wooden porch, a brightly lit house. A woman who didn't look at him like a legend, nor did she look at him like a monster. She just looked at him as a human being. Elias untied his luggage from the horse's saddle. Clara watched him. He set the bag down on the porch, then unbuckled the old gun from his hip and placed it on the table. "Just for a while," he said. Clara smiled. This West was built on lies much bigger than that. And for the first time in many years, Elias Crow laughed out loud. Not a big laugh, not a long one, but a real one. People told stories that from that day on, the ghost of Black Ridge no longer disappeared from Red Hollow. He still spoke little, still wore his old hat, and still sat on the front porch every afternoon, quietly watching the sun fall behind the prairie. Some feared him, some respected him, and some still whispered about the things he had done. But to Clara, he was not a ghost. He was the man who stayed. And sometimes, staying is truly the most courageous act of a person who has spent their whole life running away. The story of Elias Crow is not just a tale about guns, robberies, or the dusty streets of the West. It is the story of a man chased by his past, about a young girl who dared to hold on to the truth when the whole town chose to stay silent, about a community having to learn how to stand up straight again after years of bowing to power. And if there is one lesson left after it all, perhaps it is this. The past can explain who you are, but it does not have the right to decide who you will become. A person who has made mistakes can still do the right thing. A person who has run away can still turn back around. And sometimes, the very wound we try to hide becomes the thing that helps us understand the pain of others. If you ever think the best days of your life are behind you, remember Elias Crow. A silent cowboy, a legend who did not want his name called, a man who thought his life was nothing more than road dust and regrets, until the day 7 stupid outlaws decided to kidnap the wrong girl, and accidentally let live a man they should have known to fear right from the very beginning. Thank you for listening to this story until the very end. If the story of Elias and Clara made you think, leave a comment to let me know. Do you think a person can truly overcome their past? If you love these Western stories full of secrets, honor, betrayal, and courage, press like and subscribe to the channel to accompany us in the next stories. But for now, stay strong, keep stepping forward on your path, and remember, sometimes a second chance does not come in the form of a miracle. It comes as a very small choice in a very difficult moment when you decide to do the right thing. See you in the next story.